Okay, so hi everybody. It's nice to see you here today. This is the breakout session on advancing diversity and inclusion in your IT organization. And my name is Rachel Clemens. I am a vice president for industry relations at the Tambellini Group. I'm also an analyst with the firm. Tambellini is a higher education focused research and advisory firm. So we work as an analyst firm exclusively with higher education institutions and providers in the space. And so that's my focus. And then joining me here as well, though she just went off camera, is Laura Gogia. Laura is also an analyst with the firm, and she's going to be handling our Q&A today and helping to moderate a little bit. So please, looks like we have a pretty small group here, so let's try to have a really active discussion if we can. Laura has posted in the chat that she'll be handling Q&A there, and we'd love to see you chat. We'd love your ideas. Diversity and inclusion is always a learning opportunity for all of us. So there's always more that we can learn from each other about the topic. So I wanted to start out today to talk about the layers of diversity. When we talk about diversity and inclusion in organizations, often the first place that folks go to is race, gender, maybe age. But the reality is when we're talking about diversity, there's so many more sort of nuances and layers to it than that. So it starts, at those inner dimensions like age and race and gender, ethnicity, physical ability, sexual orientation, those characteristics that we often go to when we think about diversity, but really goes to all sorts of other areas and topics too. So if you think about folks who are introverts versus extroverts, sort of that personality diversity. If you think about students who are first generation or come from a low socioeconomic background. So all of these different aspects of who we are make up diversity. So when we talk about diversity, it's really thinking about how we create an inclusion. It's really thinking about how we create an environment where everybody can bring sort of their whole selves to work, right? Whether they're a veteran, whether they're a first generation, whether they're a married person, whether they're single, what are other characteristics on here, whether they're, affiliated with particular religious background or institution, that you're able to bring and create this environment where everybody feels included and like they belong in that organization. I wrote a paper about, I don't know, maybe 6 months or so ago. And actually, if you look at the bottom of this window, there is a text describing the session. And at the very bottom, there's a link. And if you want access to the paper, you can scroll down there and get it after the session. What I laid out is that DEI is really a journey. It's not, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? You have to think about it as sort of this ongoing effort and journey that you're going on, and it has multiple dimensions. So I like to think about it as sort of a multi-dimensional model. The first dimension is that you can be working on diversity, equity, and inclusion in a number of different areas. And so I characterize that as 4 different areas: leadership commitment, recruiting and hiring, IT culture, and technology design. And then in each of those layers, you can have a level of maturity. And so it's not how mature are you as an organization overall in DEI, but it could be that in your IT culture, you are incredibly mature in your practices, but in your technology design, you might be much less mature or much more immature in the way that you're approaching it. So it's really this kind of 2-dimensional model or multidimensional model of the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion that you're working in, as well as sort of the maturity in each of those areas. So I'd like, if you would, to take a second, and if you go to the poll tab, I'd love it if you could tell me which of these domains that most of your efforts are currently focused on when you think about your diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. So there's a poll there under poll. Are you focused in the leadership commitment area? Are you mostly focused in recruiting and hiring? Are you mostly focused advancing DEI in the IT culture space or in the technology design space? So let's see. How do I get? Okay. There we go. Okay, so in our group, looks like not everybody has voted yet because we have about 24 people here and I see about 15 votes. But about 40% of you all are focused in the recruiting and hiring space. 26, about a quarter in the IT culture space, just under 20% in leadership commitment, and about 12% in technology design. And that's about what I would expect, actually, because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, I would have expected maybe recruiting to be even a little bit higher. That the recruiting and hiring piece of DEI seems to be the place that organizations and people focus first, right? How do we recruit and how do we hire a more diverse group of people? But the other areas are really, really important, and they all sort of work together to create a diverse and inclusive environment. So that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. So what I've done here is I've actually copied in kind of the maturity model in this space and provided a few practices that I'd like for you to consider and think about as you think about each of these DEI areas. And lost my train of thought, sorry. Oh, what I wanted to say is I've just copied in a couple of the different strategies. And if you do go download the paper, there are actually about 10 different strategies for each of these areas. And of course, there are so many more, but I tried to limit it to 10 sort of things that you could do, actionable things you could do to really deepen your maturity in each of these areas. So if we look at leadership commitment, the thing that I would like to emphasize, even though it wasn't as highly rated on our poll, is that this is perhaps the most important thing that you can do to really advance, to start your DEI journey. And that is, it has to start with leaders, right? You have to understand your why, and you have to approach it from sort of a learner's mindset, which is to say, start understanding or start developing your knowledge and skill set in this area, and especially recognizing where you don't have maybe a deep understanding and really diving into that area. So there's a lot of work that's happened around anti-racism recently, for example, and a lot of us who have been DEI practitioners for a while have really had to kind of, double click or drill down in that area, because that wasn't necessarily an area that we understood a lot about and we're really well versed in. And that's so critical to really being able to lead this work, because if it doesn't come from a place of understanding and awareness and having grappled with your own sort of biases and recognizing where you have sort of blind spots and biases and that sort of thing, it can be really detrimental to the organization that you're leading and to those efforts to move it forward. So the guidance that I would give here is really understand your why, understand what it is that you are striving for, why this is important to you, why this is important to your organization, and be able to articulate that, right? Because it's one thing to be able to tell your teams or your environment, hey, we're going to do this because we're going to do this. But it's another thing to be able to really articulate, why it's important to the organization, why it matters to you personally, and how you're going to sort of personally lead in that organization, and how you're going to lead by example. There are places that you can go to increase your understanding and awareness. So there's a couple that I would recommend. If you don't subscribe to a newsletter called Better Allies, I would strongly recommend it. She's fantastic. She puts out, Karen, can't think of what her last name is, but she puts out, sort of quick tips every week for really continuing to be a better ally. If you're a member of EDUCAUSE, there's a group called ARIA, which is ARIA, and that's anti-racism, either in academia or in the academy. And that's a group that really is working to grapple with some of the anti-racism issues. And then there are a vast array of diversity, equity, and inclusion type of certificate programs at various colleges and universities. Right now, I'm doing one through Southern Florida, University of Southern Florida, that's online, that is also grappling with these issues. The other thing that I would suggest is, know that you'll make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And so, part of the fear, I think, for people getting into diversity work is thinking, well, I'm gonna see the wrong thing. I'm gonna do the wrong thing. And so having an understanding that you are gonna say the wrong thing probably at some time. But again, if you approach it from that learner's mindset and thinking, like, I'm gonna perhaps say the wrong thing, but then I'm also gonna take the feedback, and I'm going to accept that I've said something wrong and acknowledge it and use it as an opportunity to learn, then you will be able to move organizations much further, much more quickly and much further ahead by sort of demonstrating that it's okay that we're all in this space together, and that we're going to be learning and growing together. Okay, so moving on to recruiting and hiring. This is where folks mostly start, as I said, in their DEI journey, and organizations mostly start. So a couple of key tips here: look at your job descriptions. There are two ways that you want to look at your job descriptions. One is for gendered language. So we know that language has gendered meaning, and we know through research that job descriptions that are coded for more neutral or feminine language attract more to women, but don't discourage men from applying. And job descriptions that are coded more towards men definitely discourage women from applying. So they have more masculine language. So run it through a language filter. There are paid ones like Twilio, and there are free ones like the Gender Decoder. That you can use to really make sure that your language is inclusive when you're looking at your job description. The other thing that you want to look at in your job description is requirements, because we also know that there are gender-based differences in how people apply to job descriptions and what they will consider when they look at that list of requirements. And so to get the broadest pool possible, you want to look at making sure that you are only putting in those requirements that are absolutely essential, and that you are really keeping an open mind towards everybody else and all the different variations of people who could fill the role. And if we think about that, I've worked as a CIO in a number of different institutions, and as I've headed into those institutions, I've had people in place before I ever had to hire. And if you look at the folks in those roles, almost always they didn't come from the background or set of experiences or degree or thing that you would expect or necessarily have wanted on paper for that role. And still many of those people are really, really good and really successful at the roles that they do. And so understanding that people can bring a lot of different sets of experiences and backgrounds to these roles, and really wanting to cast the widest possible net, can help in those recruiting efforts. We also know through research that that the same resume viewed by the same people, but with a male or female name, will change the perception of the applicant. And so, and that's true for gender, that's true for race, that's true for a number of different variables. So, looking at taking out that potential for bias in the resume review process by redacting resumes and conducting blind review processes. One of the most famous research things that happened in this area was around orchestras, and orchestras used to be predominantly male. And then when they moved to having participants apply, interview, it's not really interview, but play for the orchestra behind a screen, what they found is that they were able to bring significantly more women into the orchestra. So by being able to see them, the bias, the unconscious bias that we all have crept in, and by not being able to see them, they were able to diversify the orchestra significantly more. And then really another tip that I would recommend is really looking at your interview process for inclusion. And this is not one that that happens a lot. So we talk a lot about job descriptions. We talk a lot about the hiring committees and the resume review process and all those sorts of things. But think really intentionally about the inclusion that happens during your hiring process. So are you making candidates fly on a Friday night or a Saturday, for example? Well, what if they're Jewish and that's their Sabbath? Do we want to make sure that we are putting in breaks for potentially nursing mothers who might need to pump or something like that during the interview process and send their milk home? What about vegetarians or vegans or people with food allergies? How are we going about selecting restaurants or asking them about their food preferences or their food restrictions as we bring them in for the interview process? Now, I realize some of this is virtual now and not as much face-to-face, but thinking about all those different ways that we might inadvertently preference or cause problems for candidates who are non-traditional in the process, and being really intentional about how we do that entire process. So if we look at IT culture, again, intentionality is super important, right? We can't just assume that because we bring a diverse group of people here that we are now automatically inclusive. So we have to think intentionally about the culture that we're in and how we create a culture that is intentionally inclusive. One of the best ways to do that is to adopt inclusive meeting practices. shouldn't say one of the best, one of a good way to do that is to adopt inclusive meeting practices. So there are some things that happen in meetings that are not inclusive, they're exclusionary. Things like, who is the person that predominantly takes notes in meetings? Well, often there is this sort of unstated rule about meeting housework that is often shuttled off to women, right? Or who's bringing the snacks or the treats for the meeting, or taking notes, or those types of things, the administrative parts of meetings. So setting up a schedule of rotation, that every person in a regular meeting takes the notes and then it rotates through, is one way to create an inclusive meeting environment. Another way is to send out an agenda in advance. This allows people who have different sort of personality styles. People like introverts like to think and reflect before sort of speaking up, versus extroverts are more likely to kind of speak up on the fly. So if you have an agenda in advance, you've given folks the topics that you'd like for them to think about, you are better able to allow everybody to participate at the moment, versus preferencing those folks who are more sort of inclined naturally to be able to kind of speak on the fly. The other thing to think about in IT culture is not only offering and encouraging professional development opportunities, and so really making that an opportunity for folks, but potentially including them as a requirement, right? So every time I've been in organizations, I have made professional development a required part of the annual goals process. And so you could think of DEI as another part of that professional development that you'd like to require and make sure that everybody has some level of competency around. And finally, the last area, and I find this the most interesting when we talk about this topic, is that we don't often take our diversity and inclusion practices and apply them all the way through to the technology that we're designing. But because we're technologists, and I assume most of the folks in this room are working in technology organizations in some form or fashion, the thing that we should also be thinking about is, how do we take the practices and the principles that we are thinking about in how we recruit and hire and how we create inclusive environments, and actually apply them to the technology solutions that we're designing. There are a couple of ways to do that. The first is to think about how you name things. And hopefully you have heard this, you've heard this before, but things like whitelists and blacklists are pulling from the biases that we have in our society, right? White being good, black being bad. So how do we change the naming of our, in our naming conventions, so that we don't perpetuate some of that systemic bias and racism that's in our society already? When you're forming a team for a project, think about whose perspective is missing, right? If we're working on a student solution, do we have students at the table? Do we have those students who are privileged at the table, or do we have students who have disadvantages at the table? Whose perspective is missing in the design process, and how do we bring them into this loop? And then thinking about things like, how do we design for equity and accessibility right from the start, right? So how do we look at privacy concerns and ethical concerns and accessibility, and really start with that kind of endpoint in mind and design backward from there, as opposed to designing something and then kind of overlaying some of those practices on top of it, because, oh yeah, we also have to be accessible, or oh yeah, we also should think about if there's an opt-out on data or things like that. So I know we don't have a ton of time together here today, and we wanted to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'd love to open it up for Q&A. Looks like we have, Laura, a question from AJ about the difference between hiring and IT culture.
Yeah, and that came before you laid it out, which I thought you did a great job of. It seems to me like it's an extension of hiring culture. So a lot of the same questions and considerations that you take in the hiring process is something that needs to happen in day-to-day processes. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, sure. So one is, how do we get a diverse group of people into our organization, and the second, the IT culture part, is how do we create an organization where everybody feels included or like they belong, right? And so they're important. And in fact, people will tell you, you actually should work on inclusion first before recruiting and hiring, because if you don't have an inclusive culture, you're going to spend a lot of cycles getting people to your organization, and then you're going to have a lot of a lot of attrition because you can't keep them there because the environment isn't particularly inclusive, right? So if you have to start somewhere, well, if you have to start anywhere, I would say leadership commitment. I have a good friend, Michael Cato, who some of you may know. He's the CIO at Bowdoin College, and I interviewed him a few months ago for a series that I was doing, and he said that basically that leadership commitment is so important. Leaders really need to start there because you can do a lot of damage to your diversity and inclusion efforts if we don't start there. But then the second place I would start is actually in the inclusion side versus the recruiting and hiring side. And AJ was saying he was asking a rhetorical question, so there we go. So what other questions do folks have about this incredibly important topic? Laura, what questions came up for you, or did any come up for you?
Well, one thing that I really appreciated about your talk was that you gave us some great free resources, and I pulled a couple up, the Better Allies and the Gender Decoder, but I'm fairly certain you mentioned a couple more around leadership commitment that I missed. Would you mind saying them again, maybe slower?
Yeah. So there is a group called ARIA, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, ARIA, and it's an EDUCAUSE affiliated group that's really tackling anti-racism. And I know they've been doing small group sessions where folks can really sort of grapple and have deep and vulnerable conversations around anti-racism. And so that is definitely a place where I feel like many of us would benefit from continuing to sort of increase our understanding and really grapple with the things that we don't even understand about the ways in which these things surface in our culture and in our society. The other thing is so the program that I'm participating in is University of Southern Florida's MoMA School of Business, but there are many schools that have, through their continuing education or School of Businesses, are focused on DEI certificates now. And so that would be another area or opportunity for people who are interested in expanding their knowledge. So what is a non-traditional candidate for a position? Well, it's interesting, right? Because there's no one example, but it depends on the profession. If you are if you're a teacher, often we find that men, and especially men of color, are the non-traditional candidates. But we're in IT, or at least this is an IT conference, I think. So typically we think gender, right? We think women, and we know that women make up, about, it depends on the industry, but about 20 to 25% of the workforce in IT. But we are 60% of college graduates, and we're, roughly 50% of the population. People of color are highly underrepresented in IT positions. I think only 2 or 3% of IT leaders are men or women of color. So it's a really low percentage. And so in IT, those tend to be, when we talk about non-traditional candidates, underrepresented candidates, I should say. Non-traditional candidates might be somebody without a technology degree, right? Somebody who doesn't have a CS or an IT degree. I actually came so I was a CIO for about a decade, but I never came up through an IT organization. So I didn't code. I didn't work as in the project management office. I didn't work on the help desk. I didn't work in the network area. I actually came out of software companies on the product management and marketing and sales side, and ended up being a CIO in in higher education. And so that would be a non-traditional candidate because I didn't have the background that you might expect for somebody in the CIO role. All right, so what other questions might we have? Wonder if our poll results have changed at all. Oh, they did, interesting. So leadership commitment came up. So we had recruiting and hiring. About 37% of folks were focusing their efforts there, 26% each on leadership commitment and IT culture, and only a few on technology design. And so I think actually technology design is something we've only really just started talking about, especially in light of the pandemic and all of the privacy and ethical considerations that have come up around things like Laura's favorite topic, online proctoring solutions, and other types of technologies that we have used or are using to facilitate online learning. And I think this is really important, right? We haven't historically, as IT leaders and as IT organizations, really thought critically about the technologies that we're using and how they affect, positively or negatively, the people who are using them. So have we seen co-op programs as a way for both recruiting students as well as a way for introducing more inclusivity? So it's definitely helped on the recruiting side, and lots of organizations are looking at those types of programs as a way to recruit. But inclusivity, you can't, you just because you have a variety of people in the organization does not mean that it's an inclusive environment, right? So inclusive environments are intentionally created, and it's more than just bringing people in. So I don't know the term co-op program, Kathy. I'm not really sure what you mean by that. So there are, for example, there are two different ways to look at that. One are affinity groups within an organization, and that's a strategy that organizations use to create more inclusive environments, right? So you might have an affinity group for women in IT in your organization, or women in leadership if maybe the IT organization is kind of small. So you might get together with other folks across the university, for example, or you might have an affinity group for people of color, for Black professionals in your organization, et cetera. That's sort of one way. The other way is there are organizations that are looking to bring underrepresented folks from college or from other areas into professional organizations. And so they create a pipeline of opportunity. And there's a few, and their names are escaping me at the moment, but there are a few sort of big ones. Student term positions, yeah, mentoring programs. You're right. So those are really good ways to help diversify your environments, and work on the recruiting and hiring side to create a better pipeline, which is what we hear a lot about, right? But they're not necessarily good ways to create inclusive environments. If the environment itself isn't inclusive, if you're not working on those practices, then those people are unlikely to stay. And so you've put a lot of effort and energy into a practice that isn't going to be ultimately successful. All right. Any other questions before we let you go to your break and whatever the next session is? Well, thank you. If you want more of these strategies, please don't hesitate to download the white paper. I will tell you it's formatted. So we format all of our papers for on-screen for HTML. So it's kind of a download PDF of that. So it may not look the prettiest, but it will definitely have all the information for you. Appreciate it. Laura, thank you for moderating.
And thank you very much for a fascinating session.
All right, have a good day, everybody.